Good evening and welcome back. Settle in. Lower the lights if you'd like. There is nothing here you need to do tonight. Only listen and let the world grow quiet around you. Tonight the longships leave history's main roads all together and sail off the edge of the map. Not east, where the rivers led to emperors, and not south, where there were kingdoms to plunder, but west into the open North Atlantic, the widest, coldest, emptiest water any European had ever pointed a bow at. Out there, beyond the last known islands, lay a chain of stepping stones no one had charted, an island of volcanoes and glaciers where a strange experiment in government was waiting to be invented. A vaster island of ice with a hopeful name. And beyond them both, 5 centuries before Columbus, a low green coastline with wild grapes and hostile strangers, which the Norse would find and name and briefly settle and let go. This is the story of the westward Vikings, of Erik the Red and his son Leif the Lucky, of Gudrid the Far-Traveled and a baby born at the world's edge, and of the one Viking discovery that was simply too far and too early to keep. The Atlantic adventure began, as so much does in the sagas, with people getting lost. A Norwegian bound for the Faroe Islands, storm-driven far past them, came home talking about a huge unknown land to the northwest. A Swede named Gardar sailed to check, followed the coast all the way around, and proved it an island. Enormous, green in its valleys, smoking oddly in places, and utterly empty. A third voyager, Floki, went to stay and famously took 3 ravens for the crossing, releasing them one by one on the open sea. The first flew back the way they had come, the second circled and returned to the ship, and the third flew ahead, and Floki followed it to land. He wintered badly, lost his livestock to the cold, climbed a mountain in spring and saw a fjord below, still choked with drift ice, and named the whole country in disgust Iceland. The name stuck, so oddly did the islands appeal. One of Floki's crew came home insisting that in that country butter dripped from every blade of grass. Between the ice and the butter, the North knew everything it needed: hard land, free land. Pause on what such a crossing meant, because the emigrants did not make it in warships. The Atlantic workhorse was the Nar, the longship's stout merchant cousin, shorter, deeper, higher-sided, decked only at bow and stern, with a crew of a dozen and a hold that carried everything a transplanted life required. Picture the load of one household: cattle and sheep penned amidships, horses hobbled, hay and seed corn, iron tools, chests of clothing and keepsakes, children, the elderly, dogs, all open to the sky for 600 miles of the grey North Atlantic. With fair winds, Norway to Iceland ran a week or 2. With foul ones, boats wandered for a month or vanished entirely. And the sagas record land takings that began with burying a child at the landing beach. Every farm in Iceland's history starts with the family standing in such a boat, watching for Floki's mountains, having bet everything they owned and everyone they loved on an island described to them around a fire. And free land in the Norway of the 870s had just become the scarcest thing there was. A hard-handed king, Harald Fairhair, was hammering the old independent chiefdoms into a single crown, and for every chieftain who bent, another looked west. What followed over the next 60 years was one of the great migrations of the Middle Ages, the landnam, the land-taking. Whole households, chieftains and their wives, children, servants and slaves, cattle balling in open boats, crossed 600 miles of the worst ocean in the world to claim empty valleys by walking their bounds with fire. Perhaps 10,000 came in the first generation, twice that by the end. They came mostly from Western Norway, but many by way of Ireland and the Scottish Isles, bringing Irish wives and Irish slaves. The genetics of modern Iceland still says so plainly. The men's lines mostly Norse, the women's substantially Gaelic. The sagas remember the founders by name, farm by farm, the first permanent settler, Ingolfur Arnason, tossing his high seat pillars overboard and vowing to build where the gods brought them ashore. A bay of steam vents he called Smoky Bay. Reykjavik. There is a capital city there now. Among the founders, the tradition honours most was a woman, Aud the Deep-Minded, widow of a Norse king of Dublin, who when her son fell in Scotland had a gnar built secretly in the forest, gathered her granddaughters, her followers and her bondsmen, and sailed for Iceland as the head of her own migration, pausing en route to marry the granddaughters into 2 island dynasties. In Iceland she claimed lands as broad as any chieftains, freed her slaves and gave them farms, and a Christian already, generations early, had herself buried on the tide line below high water where no pagan ground could claim her. The land taking has many founding fathers. Its founding mother outplanned most of them. What the settlers built on their empty island is the part historians never stop marvelling at. No king, no lords, no towns, no army, none of the machinery their cousins were building in Kiev or fighting in Wessex. Instead, in the year 930, the chieftains of the whole island began meeting once a year in midsummer on a lava plain where a great cliff makes a natural sounding board, at an assembly they called the Althing, laws recited aloud from the law rock by a speaker elected for the purpose, disputes judged by panels of farmers, marriages made, news traded, ale drunk. It was not a democracy. Chieftains and their followings held the power. Women and slaves held little. But it was law without a throne, a commonwealth of farmers at the edge of the world, and it ran for over 300 years. The Althing still meets. It is the oldest surviving parliament on earth, and it was invented by the grandchildren of the men who burned Lindisfarne. The Commonwealth's finest hour came at the millennium, and it belongs in any story of how these people governed themselves. By the year 1000, Christianity was split in Iceland. 2 laws, 2 faiths, kin against kin. The Althing itself on the edge of dissolving into 2 hostile assemblies. And the chieftains did an extraordinary thing. Both sides agreed to submit the question to one man, the law speaker, Thorgeir of Ljósavatn, himself a pagan priest, and to abide by whatever he ruled. Thorgeir walked to his booth, lay down and spread his cloak over his head, and for a day and a night he lay silent under it while the island waited. Then he rose, walked to the law rock and gave his ruling. One law for all, and the law would be Christian, baptism for everyone, with quiet allowances in private for the old customs while a generation passed. Both sides kept the bargain. A civil war of religion, the kind that soaked Europe in blood for centuries, was settled in Iceland by one man thinking under a cloak. Because the alternative, everyone at that assembly understood, was the end of the law itself. The old gods went out of Iceland the way its ships came in, by negotiation. And because long winters breed long stories, this scatter of turf farms became, in time, the memory of the entire Norse world. Nearly everything we have spent 4 evenings retelling, Ragnar's sons, Harald's Byzantium, The gods and the funerals survives because Icelandic farmers wrote it down. Generations later, in the great vernacular literature we call the sagas, terse, ironic, unsentimental family epics, history and fiction braided so tightly that scholars still argue over every strand. Keep that in mind tonight especially. For what happened next, Greenland and what lay beyond it. The sagas are very nearly all we have, and where we can check them against the ground, they have proved startlingly good. Enter, banished, one of the great troublemakers of the age. Erik the Red, red of hair and beard, and by the record red of temper, had already left Norway because of some killings, as the saga puts it, with characteristic economy. Settled in Iceland, he killed again in a feud over borrowed benchboards and a landslide, and the Althing's justice handed him the Commonwealth's standard sentence for men it could not afford to keep: outlawry. 3 years beyond the reach of the law, which meant, for a man with enemies, 3 years somewhere no enemy could sail. Erik had heard of such a place, skerries and a glimpsed coast far to the west, sighted generations earlier by another storm-blown sailor. He spent his exile exploring it, and found, behind the ice-choked eastern coast, deep sheltered fjords in the southwest, where the grass grew thick in summer, with seals and salmon, reindeer and walrus, and not another human soul in reach. When his sentence ran out, he sailed home and launched history's most famous real estate campaign. He called the country Greenland, the saga says, because men would be drawn to go there if the land had an attractive name. It is the age's best joke, and it worked. In 985 or 986, 25 ships sailed west from Iceland behind him, loaded with the households of the hopeful. 14 arrived. From them grew 2 settlements of turf-built farms, the eastern and western settlements, that would cling to those fjords for 4.5 centuries. A bishopric, churches, a few thousand souls at the peak, the most remote outpost of Christendom, closer to the North Pole than to Rome. Life on those fjord farms found its own strange Arctic rhythm. The turf halls were built like fortresses against cold, walls 6 feet thick, byres joined to living quarters, so the cattle's warmth was not wasted. Through the sunless months, the animals lived indoors, eating the summer's hay down to the last armful, and a farmer's whole year balanced on the weight of that haystack. Spring brought the seal migrations up the coast, the settlement's true daily bread, then the brief, brilliant green of the fjord heads, the frantic hay-making, the autumn slaughter sized precisely to the hay. It was European farming, rebuilt as a kind of high-wire act. And for 400 years, astonishingly, the Greenlanders kept their footing. Modern science has added a poignant footnote to the Greenlanders' story, read from their own bones. Isotope analysis of skeletons from the settlement churchyards tracks the colony's diet across 4 centuries and shows it slowly turning from the farm to the sea. The founders ate like Norwegians, mostly meat and milk from their cattle and sheep. Their last descendants were living, by the end, overwhelmingly on seal. The farms were failing by degrees as the cold came down and the people adapted, season by season, further and further from the European pattern they had crossed an ocean to preserve, without ever quite crossing the line into the Inuit way of life that the climate actually demanded. They bent remarkably far. The story in the bones is of a people who did nearly everything right within the world they knew, and whose world had simply drifted out from under them. and the name itself repaid the honesty. Greenland, Erik admitted, the sagas quote him nearly winking, was chosen because men would be drawn to go there if the land had an attractive name. It is sometimes called history's first real estate advertisement, and the joke is old, but it worked. 25 ships sailed from Iceland with the first colonists in 985, and only 14 arrived. The rest turned back or lost to the sea, a tithe paid before a single house was raised. The survivors named their fjords for themselves and set to work. Bishop and tithe followed the farmers, as they always did. By the early 1200s, Greenland had its own cathedral at Gardar, a stone church longer than many in Norway, with bells shipped across the whole North Atlantic and glass in its windows. And its tithes went to Rome, partly in walrus ivory, weighed and receipted by clerks in the papal accounts. There is something quietly astonishing in that ledger line, the most remote diocese of Christendom, paying its dues in the teeth of the sea. What kept Greenland alive was not the grass, it was teeth. Walrus ivory was the luxury plastic of medieval Europe, carved into crozier heads, reliquaries, sword fittings and chess sets, including, most likely, the famous hoard found centuries later on the Isle of Lewis. And the Greenland fjords guarded the richest walrus grounds in the known world. The far north hunt had one export, more glamorous even than ivory: the living polar bear, the medieval world's ultimate diplomatic gift. A Greenlander who could deliver a white bear to a king could name his reward. One saga-era Icelander famously presented a bear to the Danish court and dined out on it, so to speak, for the rest of his career. Bears from these hunts padded through the menageries of emperors, and one probably walked in the Tower of London, fishing the Thames on a long leash. It is worth holding that image against every stereotype this series has fought. The Viking Age ending not with an axe, but with the world's most dangerous housewarming present, wrapped in a net in the bilge of a Nar. Every summer, the settlement's men rowed and sailed hundreds of miles further north again, past the Arctic Circle to the hunting grounds. Every few years, a ship ran the gauntlet to Norway with tusks and hides and returned with iron, timber, grain and news. It was a life of magnificent precariousness, a European farming and hunting society grafted onto the Arctic's absolute margin, solvent only so long as Europe paid premium prices for ivory and the sea lanes stayed open. Remember that ledger. The season will turn on it. For all its remoteness, the colony insisted on being properly European. In the 12th century, Greenland petitioned for and received its own bishop, and the sea at Gardar grew into the settlement's improbable showpiece. A stone cathedral with glass in its windows and bells in its tower, a great tithe barn, byres for 100 cattle, all at the head of a fjord on the rim of the habitable world. The bishops themselves were Norwegians of varying enthusiasm. At least one never sailed out to his diocese at all, but the tithes went home to Rome, paid, the records show, in walrus ivory, sealskin rope and the odd live falcon, and crusade taxes were assessed on the world's last parish like any other. Even at the planet's edge, the paperwork found you. It is one of the most human facts in the whole story. For now, though, the frontier had energy to spare, and in the year 986, while Erik's fleet was still finding its fjords, a merchant skipper named Bjarni Herjolfsson, sailing from Iceland to join his father in the new colony, was caught in fog and north winds, driven blind across the sea for days. And when the weather lifted, saw a coastline that answered no description he had been given. Low, forested, no glaciers. He did not land. His crew wanted to. Bjarni, with a punctuality history has never forgiven, said his business was in Greenland, turned north along the strange coast, past more wooded shores, and a final rocky icy one, and duly delivered his cargo. He had almost certainly just seen North America, the first European we can name to do so, and he saw it the way a commuter sees a landmark from the train. In Greenland, men thought little of it at the time, the saga notes, but they remembered the bearings. It was Erik's son who bought Bjarni's ship, and Bjarni's directions. How anyone found anything twice in that ocean deserves its moment of respect. The sagas preserve the actual sailing directions, and they read like recited memory, because they were. From this Norwegian headland, sail due west, keeping far enough north of Shetland that you sight it only if visibility is good, far enough south of the Faroes that the sea shows halfway up their cliffs. So many days on, you will meet the birds and whales off Iceland. Latitude was held by eye and habit, the pole star's familiar height, the noon suns, with, per later Icelandic sources, a notched bearing dial as the only instrument, and perhaps, per one enigmatic saga mention, a solarstein, a sunstone of crystal for finding the hidden sun through cloud. Modern optics has shown certain Iceland spar crystals can genuinely do it, though whether sailors truly use them, the evidence stays tantalisingly thin. Mostly it was the accumulated ocean sense this series met on the whale roads of episode 1, now stretched across 2,000 miles of open Atlantic, and equal to it. Leif Erikson was everything the saga tradition wanted in a hero. Big, capable, lucky. That would become his byname, Leif the Lucky, and positioned as the founder's son to lead the colony's next reach. Around the year 1000, he ran Bjarni's route in reverse with a crew of 35. First landfall, the rocky, icy coast, a slab of stone between glacier and sea, which he named Helluland, Flatstone Land, probably Baffin Island. Then south to a low forested shore with white sand beaches, Markland Forest Land, almost certainly Labrador, and to timber-starved Greenlanders, a discovery worth the whole voyage by itself. Then on, 2 more days at sea, to the place that made the legend, an island-sheltered coast where they wintered in comfort, salmon bigger than any they had seen, mild weather, grass that barely withered, and where, in the saga's most argued over scene, Leif's German foster father, Tyrkir, came back from an evening's wandering, talking excitedly in his own language. Then in Norse, he had found grapes, wild grapes, which he knew, being from vine country, as no Norseman would. Leif named the land for them Vinland, Wineland. Where exactly Vinland's grapes grew, real grapes will not grow in Newfoundland, is a puzzle we will pick up shortly with a shovel. The expedition wintered, cut timber, loaded grapes or something, and sailed home, where Leif promptly demonstrated the other half of his luck by rescuing a shipwrecked crew off a reef along the way, cargo and all. He never went back to Vinland. His father Erik was dying. The colony needed its chief, and Leif the Lucky spent the rest of his story as a settled great man of Greenland, the discoverer in the North's memory of a land he visited exactly once. Those who followed him found Vinland less gentle. His brother Thorvald took the same ship west, explored further, and met what the sagas call, with an ugliness the modern ear must be warned of, Skraelings, the Norse name, likely meaning something like wretches or screechers, for the native peoples of the western lands. First contact, in the saga's telling, was a massacre begun by the Norse. 9 men found, sleeping under skin boats, 8 killed, answered within days by a swarm of boats and arrows. Thorvald, the only Norse casualty, pulled an arrow from his own body, observed with saga-perfect dryness that there was fat around his belly and it had found it, and died. The first European, so far as record reaches, to be killed in the Americas. And among the first buried there, his crew brought the news home. The next expedition would be different. Not a raid, not a reconnaissance, a colony. The colony's leaders are the couple this episode has been quietly waiting for. An Icelandic merchant named Thorfinn Karlsefni and his wife Gudrid Thorbjarnadottir. And if the Age has a female protagonist to set beside its warrior queens, it is Gudrid. The sagas track her from an Icelandic childhood through shipwreck on the Greenland crossing, widowhood, remarriage into Erik's family, widowhood again, misfortune after misfortune met with level-headed grace, until Karlsefni, wintering in Greenland with trade goods, married her and let her talk him. The sagas hint it was substantially her idea. Into the great venture, Vinland, to stay. They sailed with 2 or 3 ships, 60 men and 5 women by one account, livestock lowing in the holds, a farming colony aimed at the meadows Leif had praised. For a year or 3, the 2 sagas disagree, as sagas do. It worked. They wintered at Leif's old camp or near it. The cattle throve, and Gudrid gave birth to a son, Snorri Karlsefnisson, the first European child born in the Americas, 500 years, almost to the decade before the next. Trade opened with the Skraelings, and the saga's picture of it is fascinating and sad at once. The local people, ancestors most likely, of the Innu or Beothuk or their kin, brought splendid furs and wanted in return the 2 things the Norse would not or could not sell, weapons and the stranger's red cloth, which they bought strip by narrowing strip, and milk, in one telling, the colony's dairy, being to them a marvel. Between the trading came shocks. A bellowing bull stampeding out of the Norse camp and scattering a trade meeting in terror. Misunderstandings multiplying with no shared language. Then a theft, a killing, and at last an attack in force. Driven off, the saga says, when Freydis. Erik's fierce daughter, heavily pregnant and unable to run, turned on the pursuers and beat a sword against her own bared breast with such fury that the attackers broke. The saga's other Freydis story is far darker. A Vinland partnership ending in her ordering a massacre of her own partners. And scholars trust neither tale entirely. She stands in the tradition as its unresolved shadow. Little Snorri, the colony's one native-born Norseman, lived out the quieter destiny his birthplace was denied. He grew up an Icelandic farmer, built, tradition says, one of the district's first churches, and became an ancestor of note. The sagas take care to record that from Gudrid and Karlsefni's line came 3 of Iceland's early bishops, the genealogists of later centuries. And Iceland keeps genealogies the way other nations keep gold reserves, have traced streams of descendants from the Vinland baby down the generations since. It is a pleasing arithmetic for the edge of sleep. Somewhere in the world tonight, by the slow multiplication of 1,000 years, walk a great many people whose family tree begins with a birth in America, 5 centuries before Columbus. The colonists drew the obvious conclusion, like the traders they were. The land was rich beyond argument. Timber, fish, grazing, grapes somewhere south. But it was already owned by peoples numerous, capable and increasingly hostile. And every replacement axe head, every reinforcement lay a long ocean and a poor colony away. Fair though the land was, the saga has Karlsefni's company conclude, there would always be war and terror overhanging them. They loaded the timber, the furs and the baby, and sailed home. The Norse Atlantic had found its far limit, not at a coastline, but at a balance sheet. Gudrid's story, though, was not half done, and its ending outshines Vinland. Widowed once more in Iceland, prosperous, her son's farm thriving, she took the road one last time, a pilgrimage, on foot, says the saga, staff in hand, south across Europe to Rome, where one imagines the courteous incomprehension as the tall old northern woman explained where she had buried husbands and borne a son. Then home, to end her days as an anchoress beside her son's church. Iceland's tradition calls her Gudrid the Far-Traveled. Measure her journeys on a globe, Arctic Greenland to the Tiber, Vinland to Rome, and she may be the most widely travelled woman of the entire Middle Ages, from the newest world to the oldest in one lifetime, and the saga's most quietly modern heroine. One line in the records suggests the western runs never entirely stopped. An Icelandic annal for the year 1347, 3.5 centuries after Leif, notes in passing the arrival of a small Greenland ship, storm-driven to Iceland with her anchor lost, that had been on a voyage to Markland. No explanation, none needed apparently. Labrador timber, it seems, was still worth the crossing to tree-starved Greenlanders whenever a ship could be spared. The saga's far coast quietly demoted over the centuries from New World to lumber yard. It is the last written glimpse of Norse America. Not a hero's landfall, but a working boat, blown off course on an errand. So routine, the analyst spent 11 words on it. The Vinland hunger even produced a famous modern casualty. In 1965, Yale University unveiled the so-called Vinland map, a worn parchment world map, allegedly from before Columbus, showing a great island in the west, labelled Vinlanda Insula. It made global headlines. It also, over the following decades, failed nearly every scientific test applied to it, the ink betraying modern chemistry, until Yale itself formally pronounced it a forgery, a 20th century fake drawn onto genuinely old parchment. The episode is a cautionary footnote this series takes to heart. The age is romantic enough that people will manufacture evidence for it, which makes the real thing, found 5 years before the map was unveiled, all the sweeter. For 8 centuries afterward, Vinland lived only in parchment. 2 sagas that contradict each other on names, dates and geography, plus a stray mention by a German chronicler within living memory of the voyages, noted matter-of-factly that the Danish king had told him of an Atlantic island where vines grew. Enlightenment scholars mapped conjectures. Enthusiasts planted Norse ghosts from Maine to Minnesota. Forgers obliged with fake runestones. And serious history filed the whole matter, reasonably under unprovable. Then in 1960, a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his wife, the archaeologist Anne Steen Ingstad, worked the coasts of Newfoundland, asking fishermen a simple question. Any old ruins hereabouts? At the island's very northern tip, at a hamlet called Meadows, a local man, led them to what everyone called the Old Indian Camp. Grassed over ridges by a brook, 7 seasons of excavation turned the ridges into history. The unmistakable footprints of Norse turf halls built exactly as in Iceland and Greenland. A bronze cloak pin, a spindle whirl of soapstone, a woman's tool confirming the saga's women, a stone oil lamp, iron boat rivets, and the clincher, a smithy with slag and a furnace where bog iron had been worked, a technology no native people of the region used. Radiocarbons said around the year 1000. Recently, scientists dating tree rings cut by metal tools have pinned one season of Norse activity there to the exact year 1021. The sagas, it turned out, had been telling a true story all along. Embroidered, disputed, but true. Lanceau Meadows itself was likely not the sweet Vinland of grapes. No vines grow so far north. It has the look of the Enterprise's gateway, a ship repair and wintering station at the entrance to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, from which crews probed further south. The ground even hints at those probes. Among the debris lay butternuts, a species whose nearest trees grow hundreds of miles southwest, in exactly the country where wild grapes also grow. Somewhere down there, some summer around the turn of the millennium, a Norse crew stood in a hardwood forest heavy with vines and nuts. They left, so far as we yet know, nothing behind but the story. Archaeologists are still looking. It is one of the pleasant thoughts this series can offer you at the edge of sleep. The next Vinland site is out there somewhere, under a meadow, waiting for its brook and its curious local. And Greenland, the colony that launched it all. Its ending is one of history's quiet mysteries and deserves a gentle telling. For centuries the fjord farms endured. Then in the 1300s the world turned against them by degrees. The climate cooled, the long chill historians call the Little Ice Age, choking the sailing routes with ice and shortening the hay harvests that kept the cattle alive. Europe's ivory market collapsed as elephant tusk flooded in through new trade routes. The royal ship from Norway came seldom, then never. The western settlement fell silent first. A visitor around 1350 found farms standing empty, cattle gone wild, and no one, Norse or otherwise, to say what had happened. The eastern settlement held on generations longer. The last certain document of Norse Greenland is a wedding. September 1408 at Valsey Church, whose stone shell still stands, roofless above the fjord. A couple married before witnesses. The record duly copied in Iceland, where the newlyweds later settled. After that, nothing. No massacre in the record, no exodus, no final letter. The world's farthest parish simply faded from the world's attention. And when ships next came curious, centuries on, only the ruins and the Inuit, who had thrived where the farmers starved and whose traditions kept some memory of the strangers, remained to be asked. The Greenlanders were not, in their last centuries, alone up there, and the meetings the sagas barely mention. Archaeology has begun to recover. As the Norse clung to the fjords, the Thule people, ancestors of today's Inuit, master sea mammal hunters spreading east from Alaska, arrived along the very hunting coasts the farmers depended on. Norse smelted iron and chainmail rings, bronze scraps and woolen cloth turn up in Thule sites far up the coast. A small driftwood carving from an Inuit settlement seems to show unmistakably a figure in European dress. Trade, salvage, avoidance, skirmish. The evidence whispers all of these, and Inuit oral tradition kept stories of the Kavla night, the strangers long after the farms emptied. Two peoples shared the great island's dusk. The one built for the Arctic inherited it. There is one last gentle scene in the Greenland story. In 1721, a Norwegian missionary named Hans Egede sailed for Greenland on an errand of pastoral rescue. The colony, Scandinavia knew, had been out of contact for centuries, and Egede meant to find the lost Norse congregations and bring them, poor cut-off souls, the Reformation. He searched the fjords and found the churches. Roofless, turf swallowed, 3 centuries silent. Of his lost flock, nothing but stones. He stayed and preached instead to the Inuit. And modern Greenland dates its European chapter from his mission. But the image endures as the true end of the westward Vikings. A pastor with the Bible standing in the grass-grown door of Valsey Church, calling on parishioners who had been gone 300 years. 500 years after Bjarni's fog-bound sighting, another sailor would raise the far shore of the Atlantic, with a continent's weight of consequence. The Norse reach for America changed. By most measures, nothing. No exchange, no conquest, no maize in Norway. And yet it stands in this series as something almost more precious. Proof of the sheer range of the age. That the same world which sent axemen to Constantinople's throne room and law speakers to a lava plain also sent a farm family with a cradle across the whole Atlantic 1,000 years ago. The ocean was crossable all along. History, for once, simply declined to notice. Next time, our finale. The age gathers for its last great throw. A giant out of the Varangian Guard takes the crown of Norway and stakes it on England. 3 armies race through one impossible September, and at a bridge in Yorkshire and a hill near Hastings, inside 3 weeks, the Viking Age ends twice. That is where we will leave it tonight. Sleep well wherever you are, and when you're ready, we'll go wandering again.